Welcome back to the War Room. I'm David Sirota in for Michael Shore. All right, a riddle. How is the education reform movement kind of like one of my favorite movies from the 1980s, War Games?
Are those your grades?
Yeah. I don't think that I deserved an F. Do you?
I don't think he deserved an F either, do you? Education reform evangelist Tony Bennett definitely doesn't think he deserves an F. Bennett resigned last week as Florida Commissioner of Education after emails emerged showing that in his previous job as the Indiana school superintendent, he manipulated the statewide grading system to give an A rating to a charter school backed by one of his top political donors. 2/3 of the high school classes at Crystal House Academy in Indianapolis flunked algebra and 30% failed English. But Tony Bennett and his staff didn't like that, so they simply deleted the results for the school's 9th and 10th graders. Why? Well, the school was founded by Crystal DeHaan, who has donated $2.8 million to the Indiana Republican Party and over $100,000 to Tony Bennett himself. These are the same people, these education so-called reformers, who are always saying that the key to school reform is accountability. And we're really expected to believe that the so-called education reform movement is all about the kids? Not unless, quote, kids is just a euphemism for money. With us now from Washington to discuss money, politics, and education is investigative reporter and War Room favorite and one of my personal favorites, Lee Fang of The Nation. Lee, welcome back inside the War Room.
Hey, David, thanks so much for having me.
Lee, let's start with Tony Bennett. Tony Bennett, one of the biggest cheerleaders of so-called education reform, one of the national poster boys of education reform, which pushes for standardized testing, charter schools, and busting the teachers' union. Is this story about him, what he did, a microcosm of the reform movement writ large, more focused on Republican donors than on the kids themselves?
I think that's right, and we have to really kind of look at the scandal for its sheer size. I mean, Tony Bennett, he's the leader of this group, Chiefs for Change. He's gone around the country electing other school superintendents and other officials that represent his values. He's kind of famous for his tough talk of closing down public schools, using high-stakes testing and setting up charter schools in their place. And I've even heard that he would have played some type of role in a Romney administration if Mitt had won. So this is a big scandal, and it kind of underscores that that remark you just made, that this kind of mantra of the neoliberal education movement about accountability, it's kind of a fig leaf for the real interests, the real drivers of this movement that are seeking to privatize education.
Tony Bennett worked for Republican governors in Indiana and in Florida, but this is also a Democratic Party issue. The education reform movement has captured a big portion of the Democratic Party. President Obama, Education Secretary Arne Duncan, Chicago Mayor Rahm Emanuel shutting down schools, one of the biggest shutdowns of schools, public schools in the country. Why does this have any rooting in the Democratic Party, which is supposed to be the party that is for the little guy?
Well, that's a good question. I think the drivers of this movement, and it's been kind of a marriage of convenience of technology companies, of the Republican anti-union types, of big Wall Street donors. They've come together in a very sophisticated reform movement. They've set up foundations and connected themselves to both parties. You see Wall Street money pumping into the campaigns of any Democrat that seeks to push for privatization, for high-stakes testing, for an expansion of charter schools. And they've done a very good job of co-opting Democrats. And if you look at one of the biggest groups, Education Reform Now, their subsidiary is a group called Democrats for Education Reform. And I think there's no coincidence that these are many of the same types of people.
Let's turn to Jeff Bezos, who you wrote about in The Nation on their website. Amazon CEO Jeff Bezos, obviously in the news this week since he bought the Washington Post. You've pointed out in that piece at The Nation an aspect of his politics that hasn't gotten a lot of attention, that he's one of the huge supporters of education's so-called reform through his family foundation. Tell us, in light of Bezos's personal politics, in light of so many wealthy tech individuals and Wall Streeters in this issue, why are these kinds of people, Bill Gates, the Walton Family Foundation, why has this become, in particular, their pet cause?
Well, just to back up, there's been a lot of talk on Wall Street about, the next big market. How do you take cafes and turned them into a Starbucks, and there's this $500 billion pot of money, the amount we spend every year on K through 12 education that many would like to see privatized. I can't speak to exactly what's motivating Bezos, but what's very interesting, if you look at his financial footprint, where he's been donating his money, his almost biggest cause is education reform. Many of these groups that he's donating to, some are non-controversial, like math and science programs at charter schools, but also he's given to groups that are running attack ads against teachers' unions. So you have to question what is his political agenda. I'm reserving judgment now because we don't know exactly what Bezos is going to do with the Washington Post. But we've seen time and time again these billionaires buying up media properties just to promote their own pet causes. So it's something to watch for.
And what a powerful weapon the Washington Post could be if he chooses to use it for the cause of privatizing public education. Speaking of the Washington Post reported this week that Jeb Bush has been using a foundation focused on so-called education reform to essentially launder corporate money. It lobbies lawmakers all over the country to pass education laws that favor its corporate donors. His foundation isn't the only one that does this, but it's a big example of laundering corporate money, turning it into political influence on behalf of privatizing public education, all to serve the bottom line financial interests of those donors. How does this work in practice? How does a foundation like this turn a corporate agenda into legislation at, let's say, the state level?
Well, I can speak from experience. I've gone to conferences hosted by the Jeb Bush Foundation, and it's very interesting. And I went to one in San Francisco a couple years ago, and you go to these sessions where you have people like Tony Bennett presenting, talking about accountability, about the different reforms that are needed. But then you go into the hallway, and companies like Pearson's, like Connections Academy, like K-12 Inc., some of these very controversial virtual charter schools where there's no even brick and mortar school. It's just giving a child a computer and telling them to learn that way. Well, you have lobbyists walking around the hallway, handing out their business card, giving out model legislation to the legislators and the other policymakers that attend these types of conferences, teaching them, how to implement these reforms, what type of rhetoric to use, but also literally the legislation that they should enact in their own personal states.
And again, a lot of that legislation ends up benefiting the donors' financial for-profit interests that they gave to the Bush Foundation, and that then becomes legislation in states all over the country. Lee Fang, as always, thanks for your reporting. Thanks for being here. That's